In this video, we will try to reuse a rusty toolbox as a rolling tool cart. First, we will start with a quick introduction. I was asked to dispose of an old Craftsman toolbox. Here we can see the condition of the toolbox. The toolbox had surface rust and the drawers were just about stuck closed. Rather than throw away the box, I wanted to see if I could reuse it. Although I did not need a stationary toolbox, I thought it would be a good idea to have a rolling tool cart. Since the box was able to roll, I had a couple ideas on how to make this work. First, I thought building a small wall or barrier on the top would help to keep items from falling off. And since this was going to be a rolling cart, I also wanted to have a handle. After looking at the condition, I wanted to first start with the surface of the box. I started with the top area. So my main tools were a scraper tool, a flat file, and then later some sandpaper. This is definitely not a how-to video. Like many videos on this channel, it's meant to share an idea that I had and wanted to try. Usually with a surface like this, some kind of a chemical stripper, sandblaster, or media blaster would be used to get down to a smooth, clean surface. Since I had none of those tools, I just wanted to remove some of the surface rust. Although the surfaces were thin sheet metal, there was still enough material to scrape them and not create too many holes. I then moved to the inside area at the bottom of the toolbox. Again, these would just help to remove some larger areas of corrosion and surface rust. The drawers were stuck but not locked, so I used a tool to pry them open. The drawers themselves had a lot of surface rust. I also used a wire brush on a grinder to help remove corrosion. Although it wasn't down to bare metal, the brush did take away a lot of the surface rust very quickly. As seen, the corrosion on the lower corner was deep enough that the use of the wire brush created holes. I kept my expectations reasonable that this would be a quick project that would have a practical use rather than it being a restoration. I had a lot of extra steel flat bar and steel tube which I knew would be perfect for this project. I started to measure the flat bar and tube. I also considered the lip that was on the top of the box. I marked the flat bar so that I would cut a notch onto it and then it would be placed on top of the lip. I did this for both of the longer sides. I thought this would be an easy way to use a single piece of flat bar all the way to the handle. I used a bench vise to hold the flat bar and a grinder to cut a notch and the end of the bar. I repeated this process for the second piece. I used magnets to help hold up the flat bar. The magnets held the two long pieces on the top of the toolbox. I then marked the smaller previously cut pieces for use on opposite sides. I then used the bench vise and angle grinder to cut the edge on the piece. I repeated this process on the last piece. As you can see, I even marked them front and rear as a reference for placement. I also used the bench vise to cut the steel tube. Since the hole on the bottom corner was large, I wanted to mark some flat bar which would reinforce the corner. So back to the bench vise and grinder to cut the smaller pieces of flat bar for the corner. I grinded the edges of the flat bar. I used the file to help with the edges of the steel tube. As you will see, I don't know how to weld properly, but this project would help to motivate me to use the small welder I purchased. When I tacked this flat bar on the bottom, you can see where I accidentally pulled up. I also used two flat bar pieces inside. I tacked them up quickly. Along with my own bad welds, I know it's very hard to weld thinner metal than thicker. So the pieces inside were placed there to help reinforce the flat bar, welds, and heat from the outside. At this point, I focused again on the flat bar on the top of the toolbox. I started to tack and weld these top pieces together. I used the help of magnets to hold the handle in place. Once the handle was tacked, I continued to weld the handle to the flat bar. I continued to tack and weld the other corners of the flat bar. I used the grinder on the edges of the flat bar near the handle to help smooth them. I then continued to use the grinder on the edge below the handle. I continued to weld around the handle and edges of flat bar. Now this was overkill, especially if the welds were done properly. I kept going over it to get more time getting used to the welder. I also thought that in this area more than everywhere else would have the most stress. The stress I'm thinking of would happen over time from constantly being pushed or pulled. The only other stress I could think of is if items were clamped down near the edges of these flat bars. Since the heat did push the sheet metal away from the flat bar, I wanted to experiment with how to close the gap. As you can see, I even wanted to try some nails as filler. They were too small or just the wrong material for the job. The nails melted and filled some of the area, but it was building the weld on top of itself that ultimately filled in the gap. This experiment with welding the corner was a lot more a lesson of how not to weld. That being said, the corner is better off than being left alone with the hole. The main reason these drawers were stuck was because of the guides. These included the rails on the drawers and the tabs on the toolbox. I used 2 hammers to help straighten the rails. At this point, I taped off the Craftsman logo for fun. I started to paint by brush with Rust-Oleum black. Since this isn't a restoration, the goal of painting was just to cover the rust and help delay some of the corrosion from spreading. As seen, the painting was rushed and it really shows. It was way too thick and started to run immediately. Spray paint would have probably been another option that would have given the same or better results. I just had so much of this paint that it was a lot cheaper to brush it on than buying multiple cans of spray paint. As seen, it wasn't only the rails that were crooked. It was also the tabs on the toolbox that were the guides for the rails. I used the bench vise and tools to straighten the rails. I filed some of the rust and corrosion off of the rails. I used grease to help these rails slide. Since these bearings were open on the bottom, I also greased them to help the cart roll better. I used a little Marvel Mystery Oil to lubricate hardware around the wheels. The cart became a greasy mess, but it was able to roll fine and the drawers were able to open and close with no problem. Overall, I wasn't happy with the quality of workmanship for this project. I did, however, think the overall idea was interesting enough to share. That being said, I share these videos because they may give you and others ideas. And as seen on this channel, I find it interesting to try different types of small projects. I've been using the cart for a while and it's helped out a lot with convenience. Thank you for watching.